I'm here today with Bill Lenkey. It's September 18th, 2006, shortly after 6:30 p.m. at his home in Miranova. Could you state your name, please?
I'm Bill Lenkey,
And what is your birth date?
August 30th, 1930.
And what is your ethnic background or makeup?
Hungarian.
All right. And where were you born at?
Here in Columbus, Ohio, in the deep South End.
All right. And do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have a brother and sister who are deceased, and I have a brother who's still living and a sister who's still living.
And where do you fall in that row of siblings? Are you oldest, youngest?
Let's see. I am next to the youngest. There were 6 of us. And I need to correct that. I have 2 sisters that are still living. There were 3 sisters and 3 sons.
All right. What is your earliest memory?
As I told my therapist years and years ago, that when I was 4 or 5, I, at that time, began to be worried about the fact that when I grow up, I was going to have to get married to a woman when I really wanted to be with a man. And when I told my psychiatrist that, I prefaced it by saying, "You won't believe this." And he says, "Yes, I believe it because I hear it all the time."
Wow. Where did you attend grade school at?
Initially at Smith Road, which was a county school, and then I attended 8th grades there, and then went to South High School here in Columbus.
All right. And you completed high school at South?
Yes.
And what year did you graduate?
1949.
All right. When you were still in school, do you recall any of who your heroes were?
Heroes in, like, movie star or?
Anyone at all, just people that you thought were pretty cool or that you looked up to?
Well, most of the people that I looked up to is because they were handsome and they were sexy. But as far as the movie stars,
do you recall anyone in particular?
wait a minute, John Payne and Montgomery Clift, Tyrone Power.
How old were you when you first realized that you were different than the other kids?
As I said, I knew then at a very early age, and in my early years, I would be playing around with my friends. You know, it was just kind of just nothing really overt, but just playing around. And I remember on one occasion, my brother had a friend that the 2 of them would go fishing, and one day he came to our house and was looking for my brother, and my brother wasn't there, and he asked if I would like to go for a walk with him. And at this time now, I'm living out on Woodrow Avenue, which was like a little farm area because my parents had 3.5 acres. And there was a railroad track, and so we were walking down the railroad track, and along the railroad track were what we called the woods, and we used to play in the woods all the time, my brother and I, and so forth. But anyhow, there was this boxcar, and the door was open, and he asked if I would like to get up in the boxcar. And I did, and while we were in there, he proceeded to take his clothes off. Now, this guy probably was 17 or 18, if I remember correctly, because at that time I probably was only around maybe 10 years old. And he proceeded to take his clothes off and then asked me if I would take my clothes off. And then he laid down on the floor of the boxcar and asked me to get on top of him, which I did. And I was quite aware that he had hair on his chest and he had an erection, and I know that I had an erection. And I never fondled him or anything like that, but just being on top of him and so forth, I knew that I was getting this very strange feeling. And because it was so strange and I didn't understand it, I stopped. And years later, when I had my first orgasm, I remembered that same feeling. And I, believe it or not, at 10 years old, had I gone on, I probably would have had an orgasm.
What happened after you stopped?
Well, nothing overt. We just proceeded to get up then and put our clothes on, and he walked me back home.
Was that the first time that you had some sort of overtly sexual experience
Yes.
with another man, boy?
Yes.
At that time, did you put any kind of a name on it? Did you understand what it was, or that it was different than what boys or men usually do, or?
No, not at that time. I really didn't. I really didn't start worrying about it until years later when my family are Roman Catholics, and of course, having gone to a public school and not going to a Catholic school, I really didn't get what you call a real thorough background, although my mother was very good about teaching us our prayers and so forth. And while I was in high school, I became somewhat very active in church. And at that time, at St. Ladislaus Parish in the South End, there was a priest there by the name of Father Rio. And he sort of took a liking to me, and really I consider him one of my mentors. I've been blessed with a number of mentors in my lifetime, and he was a mentor for me, and he took an interest in me because I really never had a good relationship with my father, because my father was 13 years older than my mother. So, and I'm sure that my father was probably in his 50s when I was born. So I never really had a father-son relationship. So Father Rio mentored me, and one time he just happened to say to me, had I ever thought that I might want to go to the seminary? Well, to be honest with you, I really hadn't thought about it, but he sort of planted the seed, and I thought, well, gee, that would be something that would please him, and I wanted his friendship, you know. So I ended up going to the seminary, and I spent 4 years here in Columbus at St. Charles, because that at one time was a minor seminary, and then went to Cincinnati for probably maybe about six months or a year before I realized I really didn't have a vocation. So when I came home, things weren't the same then, of course, with my relationship with Father, because, you know, he had no reason to continue our friendship, because that was his goal, was to hopefully I would go on to the seminary and be ordained a priest.
After you indicated before, you started realizing that you might be different, that you had different feelings towards men when you were 4 or 5 years old. Did you ever talk with anyone about those feelings when you were a kid?
No.
Did you have any other friends that you thought might also be like you and discuss those kinds of issues with them?
No, we never discussed it, but we did play around as kids, and you know, nothing ever was said about it afterwards.
When you were growing up, did you ever hear other people talk about gay people?
I did, but not in a favorable way.
What kinds of things? Do you remember what people would say?
Well, you know, queer, derogatory remarks, you know, that type of thing. So consequently, I would never, you know, say anything about my so-called homosexuality.
Were there any other people in the community around where you lived that were gay that you're aware of?
No, but you know, I did have a couple of very close relationships with classmates while I was like maybe in the 7th or 8th grade, but we never thought of ourselves, we never talked about being gay or being any different. It was just horsing around, so to speak.
At what age did you start to study to be a priest?
right out of high school. I graduated in 49 in June, and I was going to St. Charles in September of 49. Graduated from St. Charles in 53, and then went down to Mount St. Mary's in Cincinnati for 6 months, 8 months, whatever. Then after that, I started working, and at that time I probably became a little more overt in my actions. I was maybe going to the gay bars and things like that, but not on a real terrible steady basis. And then I thought that I met this girl, and we had a very nice, close relationship, but nothing sexual. And I finally decided that I probably should get married, so I got engaged. And right after I got engaged, that's when I met David. And my relationship with him was, I was more certain than ever that I would never be able to marry and really be happy. That my relationship with him from the very beginning, matter of fact, the very first night I met him, I, at that time, knew in my heart that I was going to end up living with him for the rest of our lives. And I was with David for 41 and a half years before he passed away. So I broke my engagement and came back to Columbus because at that time I was working in Detroit. And while I was in Detroit, I was beginning to go to the bars and meeting other people and so forth. Then after I met David, I moved in with him in January, and then in August we started looking for a place, and that's how I ended up, how the two of us ended up in German Village. At that time, of course, it wasn't German Village, because I'm talking about 1957 now, 58. And we bought the house in the village. And our neighborhood at that time was just elderly, retired people, no young people around.
All right, let me ask you a couple of questions. After you came back from Cincinnati,
Mm-hmm.
after you decided Cincinnati was not for you,
Mm-hmm.
and did you come back to Columbus?
Yes.
Okay. Where were you living at that point in time?
On Woodrow Avenue.
All right. When you came back to Columbus, you then went to Detroit at some point?
Yes.
Wait, how long were you back in Columbus before you went?
Just for probably a few months before I found a job with a company called Directory Distributing in St. Louis. And they were here, and they had their so-called delivery site at the fairgrounds. And their responsibility was they contracted with all the telephone companies throughout the United States. And their function was to send in a group of people to handle the actual city delivery of telephone directories. So I went and applied for a job, and I got the job, and I was with them for 2.5 years. And because their regional office was in Detroit, that's where I was stationed, and I lived in Detroit. And anytime I worked out of Detroit, I was on an expense account. And anytime that I was in the Detroit area, of course, because I lived there, I was on my own, so to speak.
At the time that you moved back to Columbus from Cincinnati, had you put a name on what your feelings were about men? Had you decided that you were different, or that you were gay, or?
Do you know that the first time I heard the word gay, I just didn't quite understand what gay was. And then somebody said queer, and then I made the relationship between gay and queer, you know. And I ended up liking the term gay better than queer.
When you moved back to Columbus, did you consider yourself heterosexual?
No. I just knew that I was different.
The first time that you went to a gay bar, was that in Detroit?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
That's interesting. I had a friend of mine that I was in college with, matter of fact, in the seminary also, but he left a couple years before I did, and he was inducted, because this is during the Korean War time, so he was, or after the Korean War, but it was still the draft, so he was drafted. And after he got out of service, he kept in touch, and we were good friends, so we kept in touch, and I was already working in Detroit, and he was looking for a job. So I asked him if he'd be interested, and he came to Detroit and got an interview and so forth, and got hired. So sometimes we would be working together on the same jobs. And we were in Detroit one time, and we never talked about our so-called our gaiety or being homosexual and so forth. We knew, and I had no interest in him physically, and he had no interest in me. But he knew that I'm sure he was much further ahead as far as understanding what this was all about and so forth. So one time he said to me, "We're going to go out tonight, and I'm taking you to a bar." And I said, "Well, what kind of bar are we going to?" And he said, "Well, it's I think you'll like it. There'll be a lot of people there, and so forth." And by this time, I sort of knew that even though we never talked about it, I knew that he had gay inclinations, and I'm sure that he knew I had gay. So anyhow, we went to a bar in downtown Detroit called the Silver Dollar. And I walked in there, and here it was just absolutely packed with all these so-called beautiful young men. And I looked at Bill and I said, "You mean they have the same problem that I have?" I thought I had a problem. And then that was where I really started going to the bars.
And this would have been in the early 50s?
Yes. Yeah.
What was the bar like? What was going on when you got there?
They had entertainment and dancing, and of course loud music, and like I said, lots of beautiful, handsome young men.
After you got settled into Detroit, did you come back to Columbus to visit your family members or friends?
Yes. Every so often I would end up having a delivery here in Columbus, so I would stay with my mother. And sometimes I would have a delivery in Indiana, like South Bend, Indiana, Richmond, Virginia, Tallahassee, Florida. So I did a lot of traveling, and really for me it was a good job because it gave me, I became a little bit self-confident with my talent and so forth, and I could manage people, and I learned a lot about people, and then ended up, that's what my working career was. I was in management from that day on. Every job I had, I was in some kind of a management. So it was a good start for me. And one time when I was in Steubenville, I came home for the weekend, and that's the weekend then that I happened to go to the Deschler Wallach. Do you ever remember the hotel?
I know the hotel you're talking about.
And they had up on the 16th floor, they had a beautiful restaurant and a bar. It was called Suite 16. The bar was known to be kicky. The dining room was strictly heterosexual, dinner, dancing, and so forth. So on that Saturday night, I ended up going there to the bar at Suite 16, and it was packed, and a lot of people were talking and saying, "Well, are you going to the 5-5?" And I said, "The 5-5, what's that?" It's a bar on Long Street, and it's its last night because the building has been sold, and they're going to tear it down. They're going to build a big parking garage there. It's right across from what used to be the Trade Winds. Not the Trade Winds, the garage.
Sure, I know what you're talking about.
What was the other name? Garage and...
Trends?
Trends. Okay, right. So anyhow, I walked in there and I was nervous as hell about going there. And so I thought, well, I'll just get myself a beer and I'll stand at the door in case the place gets raided, and I'll be able to escape, so to speak. And about the time I was standing at the door, these three guys came up, and all three of them started talking to me. Now, they didn't know each other, but they all converged on me at the same time. And, we were making small talk and so forth. And this is August, and it's hot, no air conditioning or anything. And this little redheaded kid, who was David, we were talking, and he said, it's so hot here. And he said, I don't know why I'm here. I should be at home in my air-conditioned apartment. And he said, would you have any interest? So that was the first night with David, and I had to go back to Detroit. And he said, when are you coming back? And I said, well, I'll be back for Labor Day. And he said, well, give me a call. And he was a pharmacist at Went Bristol. And at that time, Went Bristol had a big pharmacy on State Street, right between the Ohio Theater and the Grand Theater. And back in those days, a pharmacist did more than just count pills. I mean, he actually had to make lotions and salves and ointments and all the whole bit. And they had 12 of them there, and it was really a busy place. So anyhow, he said, now call me when you're coming home, which I did, and that was about 2 weeks later. And of course, when I called, he didn't answer the telephone, and I asked for him, and the guy said, just a minute, and I said, David got on the phone and said, hello, and I said, David, this is Bill Lenkey. And he said, Bill who? And my heart, and I got all, what have I done? And then, Bill, I thought you'd never call. Are you going to be home this weekend? And so that was the beginning.
What year was it that you guys met?
1957. August of 57.
How did you find out that the Sweet 16 bar was a place where people that were gay might go to meet?
I started hearing people talk about it, and even before that, after I had left the seminary, there was another guy in the seminary that we all sort of thought, because he was so flamboyant, we all sort of thought that he was gay, After I had left, he called one night, and he said, he was from Zanesville. He says, I'm in Columbus, and he says, I'm at a bar over on Mound and Front. And I said, you are? He said, yeah, it's the Blue Feather. Oh. Now, I had heard about the Blue Feather, and I knew what it was, and he said, why don't you come over and join me? Well, there was no way I was going to go out at 10 o'clock at night and go to the Blue Feather. So, see, I was beginning to hear about these places, and then sooner or later I started hearing about, I was telling people about the Blue Feather. Oh, well, there's another place, and then they said, the Sweet 16 at the Deschler. And he said, that would be more to your liking, So that's how I ended up there.
What was the room like at the Sweet 16? What was the setup in the room?
Well, it was all windows. Like I said, tables with white tablecloths, dance floor, and then the bar faced out onto the city. And the
Sunset.
Mm-hmm. And you had to walk up like maybe 3 steps because the bar was elevated. Right.
How was it that a hotel bar became a place for gay people to meet? Is it because of the transitory nature of the people who were there, or is it because of the people who worked there might have been gay?
No, I think it was first of all, it was one of the nicest places in Columbus. And, a lot of gay people like to go to nice places, and they like to have And be safe, supposedly be safe, because the people who would go there, you would never have to worry about them like being hustlers or anything like that. And a lot of hotels, because of the transitory nature, and then the people who live there always know, well, you can always go to a hotel bar and you're going to either meet somebody who's gay or who's bisexual. And then of course a number of people would go out as couples, and they would go there after dinner to have a drink or something.
What was this 55 place like?
It was just a big old bar, nothing fancy to it.
Was it on the first floor of the building?
Yes, right on the very first floor. And the building itself was kind of old and decrepit. Matter of fact, I had never heard of the 55 until the night that I went to Suite 16.
And did they have dancing there, or was it strictly just a place to go and drink?
Strictly go drink and meet people. Back in those days, believe it or not, all the bars that I would go back in my early days did not have dancing. It was much later when dancing really started at the bars.
You mentioned when you went to the 55 that you stayed close to the front door in case the place might get raided.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever hear any stories about bars around here being raided, or were you ever present when that happened?
No, but I knew that when we'd be in Detroit and so forth, we were always cautious about that. And any cities that you would go to, like Fort Wayne, Indiana, or South Bend, even though they're small towns and so forth, people were still very cautious about where they were and where they might be going.
You mentioned after you and David started your relationship, you purchased a house in German Village.
Mm-hmm.
And did you say it was 1957?
58 is when we.
I'm sorry.
58 when we actually started looking for the house. After I came back to Columbus, and David asked me if I wanted to move in with him, and he had a very cute little apartment over on Oak and Grant called Library Court.
Sure, that's still there. Yeah,
yes,
I
it
know
is.
what you're talking about.
That's right. And so I moved in there, and that was in January or February, and I got a job with Nationwide Insurance, so I could walk back and forth. And in August of 57, or October of 57, we went to Williamsburg. Now, I had already been to Williamsburg because when I did my job with the director of distributing, I was in Richmond, and one of the guys who headed up the delivery at that time, he was a great traveler, and he knew all the places to go, and he loved historical things. So he asked me if I had ever been to Williamsburg, and I never heard of Williamsburg other than, history. I never knew anything about what it was all about and what the Rockefellers had done and so forth. So anyhow, we went down there. And then after I met David, I was telling David about Williamsburg and Richmond and so forth. So we went to Williamsburg, and on the way back home, he said, wouldn't it be kind of fun to get an old house and fix it up, like they did in Williamsburg? And I said, well, we could start looking. So we looked in Clintonville, and we looked in Arlington, and Grandview. Then we came back to the South End. And see, that area of German Village was probably about 10, 15 blocks north of where I grew up. And when I say deep south, that's down there near Woodrow and Hozak and Barthman and Ennis, all that area. Which, believe it or not, when I grew up there, it was a very nice area because we had Hungarians, Croatians, Slavs, Germans, Italians, the whole bit. And everybody kept their homes up nicely. Parsons Avenue was a very vibrant street. You could go out any hour of the night and there'd be people on the street going to the grocery stores, doing this, doing that. So coming further in, because by that time that area was beginning to slip, We came down to German Village and we drove around and we found this house that was for sale, and not knowing much about houses. And by this time I had met Twink, and Twink was real estate business. So David said, well, let's call Twink and ask him to come down and look at it. So he came down and looked at it and gave us his ideas. And he said, well, make an offer,
Where was the house located at?
On the corner of City Park and Concord, which is a half a block south of Whittier. You know where Roosters is?
Sure.
Okay. If you would come out of Roosters and you'd walk south, there's a street that dead ends into City Park called Concord. And our house was right on the corner of Concord and City Park. The front gate had a gas light. The back gate had a gas light. You remember, by chance, do you remember that house?
No, but I'll look the next time I walk down the street to the park.
That. So when we really got serious about it, we called him again and asked him to come, because at that time we really were serious. So he did, and we made an offer. And like I say, 41 and a half years later, I was still living there. I lived there another 2.5 years after David passed away, and then I sold it and I moved here.
What was it that drew you to German Village? Was it just there was a house there that you were attracted to?
Plus, see, David was a pharmacist on State Street. I could walk to Nationwide Insurance. It was on a bus. It was on a bus line if we needed to,
Where was Nationwide that you worked at?
246, which is the building, before you get to the two towers at Nationwide, right on the corner of Chestnut and High is the 246 building.
Okay.
That was the original Nationwide.
Okay,
Right.
I understand.
And I worked there for 13 years before I left.
At the time that you purchased the house in German Village, who were the residents down there? Who was living there?
An elderly couple that had moved from Florida back to Columbus, and they moved in, and evidently they realized that this is not what they wanted, and they put the house up a few months after they bought it. And when we went to look at it, they hadn't even unpacked all their stuff, because it was still, and all they wanted to do was sell it,
Who was living in German Village at that time?
A lot of elderly people, meaning husbands and fathers and mothers, and the children had gone to the suburbs. There were a few people there still with youngsters, but not many at all. The neighborhood was run down. The houses hadn't been taken care of because, like I said, the younger people had moved out. The elderly people were all retired and didn't have the income to keep up the houses.
When was it that gay people started moving into the neighborhood by large numbers?
Okay. After that first House and Garden Tour, which was 1960, and by that time there had been a lot written about German Village and what was happening in German Village. And I'll say right now, before I forget it, if it hadn't been for the gay people that came to German Village, there would never be a German Village today, because they were coming down, and gay people are very artistic. They're very good about knowing what to do with things and how to do things. And initially, after that first House and Garden Tour, that's when they really took an interest in buying up real estate down there. And Tweak and I know a lot of people who bought houses down there, and they were in the position where they could buy 3 and 4 houses, fix them up and sell them. And for the first, I'd say for the first 5 or 6 years, people were making money hand over fist that way, before it finally settled down where everything had been bought up, so to speak. I shouldn't say everything, because there's still things down there that could be restored. And our big problem with German Village, even yet today, is what we call the absentee landlord, who bought up all this property, and all they've done is just clean it up, but they've not restored it, see.
Who were the people, if you remember, that organized that first House and Garden Tour?
Okay. I'm a charter member of the German Village Society, and that's something else. David and I were still kind of uncomfortable about living together, and so we really never talked about where we lived and so forth. So David, I was the one that got really interested in German Village, joined the society, volunteered to do this and do that and so forth. And David was always in the background. He didn't want to, and anytime I had any type of a function at the office and so forth, he would not go, In the same way, if he had a function with his pharmacy people, I would not go, because it just wasn't comfortable at that time still for two boys to be living together and having a house and fixing up a house and so forth, But you asked who the original people were. Phil Keentz and his wife, Helen Newkirk and her husband, Dorothy Fisher and her husband, and maybe you saw the big write-up about Dorothy Fisher. Then there was somebody that we called the Colonel and his wife. And believe it or not, Dave and I were probably the two youngest of the people at that time in the village. And our house was on the very first tour, which was 1960. There were 10 houses that time. The tour started at 12 o'clock and went to 6 o'clock instead of starting at 9 o'clock and going until 6 o'clock. The ticket was $1 to walk through 10 houses.